Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us in today's session, Regeneration, Urban Edibles and Food Forests. My name is Ron Arell. I'm with American Dairy Association Northeast and a planner for the Chesapeake Watershed Forum. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. If we could move to the next slide, please. This session will be recorded, as you probably just saw, and made available at a later date. All attendees should be muted at this point. If you have any questions or feedback, please use the chat box or Q&A features in Whova or Zoom. If you have any technical difficulties, please send a message in the chat box to me or the host, and we'll do our best to help you out. We do encourage you to rename yourself with your preferred name, pronouns, and organization. To do so, hover your mouse over your image to show the drop-down menu and select rename. Finally, the rest of the forum schedule can be found on Whova. Thank you very much. I'll now turn it over to our speakers, Christine Gyovai and Sarah Coffey, who will take it from here.
Great. Thanks so much, Ron. We appreciate it. We're really delighted to be here today, and thanks so much to the forum for having us. We appreciate it, and we are excited to be here. We're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves, and then we have a couple questions for folks in just a moment. So I'll introduce myself, then Sarah will introduce herself, and we'll get rolling. My name is Christine Gyovai. I'm a facilitator and planner with Dialogue and Design Associates, and we're based in Central Virginia, and we focus on the Mid-Atlantic and Central Appalachia, helping folks to envision their future and find tools and resources to make it happen. We launched a podcast this summer called Collective Resilience, We Rise, and we actually have an episode that was released today, episode 18, focused on the Chesapeake Bay, coastal resilience in St. Michael's, Maryland. And so feel free to check it out. So delighted all of you are here. We will put our email addresses, it will be included in a slide towards the end, but they're here as well. So Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Christine. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Coffey. I'm the Upper James Watershed Field Technician, which is a mouthful, with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And so basically, I'm working in the Upper James Watershed on installing, helping to design, implement, and maintain riparian forested buffers. So I work with all different kinds of landowners on creating a buffer that works for them and works for the Bay. And I'm really excited to speak with you all today. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sarah. We're so excited to do this session together. Sarah and I get to work together in professional capacities, but it's fun to put our collective brains together for this session. So thanks to all of you for joining. So today we'll look first a little bit at landscape regeneration examples at some larger scale. What does landscape regeneration look like? We will then zoom into a few case studies, an edible forest garden in Central Virginia, examples from around the world. We'll look at a few specific plants and some of the functions that they provide. And then we'll look at opportunities and challenges of increasing food forests. Sarah will talk about municipal scale strategies. We'll have time for questions and discussion. We'll go into breakout groups towards the second part of our session today. You'll get a chance to share your own knowledge, reflections from today. And if you don't have experience in urban edibles or food forests before, that's completely fine, because we welcome for you just to bring your experience and questions wherever you are. And we'll wrap up with time for questions and discussion around the top themes. So that's where we're headed today. I'm going to go ahead actually and stop sharing my screen just for a quick minute and ask if folks, if you're not able to do this, that's completely fine, but Laura's going to put a couple questions in the chat roll for us. If you're able to turn your video on to do a show of hands, and feel free to take a look around at who's in the room. So again, if you're in a place where you can share your video or turn your video on for a moment, feel free. And if you can't, that's totally fine. We do want to ask for folks to raise your hand or put in the chat roll who's heard of a food forest before, and who has experience working with food forests, and who has a couple years of experience working with food forests. So it's nice to see some of your faces. Feel free to scroll through the chat roll as folks are coming on. We're in this virtual space here. So again, either you can respond in the chat roll or raise your hand. Who's heard of a food forest? That's the first question. So you can just put yes in the chat roll. Who's heard of a food forest, or raise your hand, or you can find the hand raise button before. Great. So some of our folks with their video on, hello folks, have experience with food forests before. If this is your first example or first time hearing of food forests, welcome. Who has at least 1 or 2 years of experience working with food forests in some way? A couple hands are And you can say 1 to 2 years in the chat roll. I see Brittany has some experience. I've heard of food forest, awesome. I've heard of multifunctional riparian buffers, but not a food forest, awesome. I've heard the phrase, but couldn't define it. Okay, great. And who's had 5 or more years of experience working with food forest before? You can raise your hand or pop it in the chat roll, 5 or more. Who has never heard of a food forest before? Yeah. Okay, that's okay, super helpful and welcome. We're glad you're here, and feel free to add your questions to the chat roll or in the Whova platform. Ron's going to be pulling questions for both today, and we'll have a couple different points for engagement. So thanks for folks who were able to turn your videos on there, and I'm going to start sharing my slides again here in just a second. Hang on. All right, just 1 second there. There we go. Always the danger when you introduce something new. All right. All right, Sarah, can you see those fine?
Yep, looks good.
Excellent, great. All right, so to dive in at first here for landscape regeneration and food forests. The first part of our presentation is going to start with a quick story, and this is a couple photographs from Missoula, where my family and I took a cross-country road trip this summer. We had to get the kids out of the car and running around and spend a lot of time in the car, so we went for a run in Missoula. And we were running through a park where there were lots of different camps taking place, all kinds of folks, all different ages and varieties of folks were in this park. And they had different apple trees planted along the park. And you can see in the top photo in the upper right-hand corner, some of the apple trees. Well, I picked a few. There were a lot of apple trees in the park, brought them back to the car after we got back from the run, and our kids tasted them and they said, whoa, these apples are amazing. And you can see them actually literally running to the apple tree. They were so excited about picking more apples. They did a little grazing and picked a few more apples and brought them back with us. So there's a lot of power in urban edibles. There's also a lot of power and potential in landscape regeneration and the different ways that plants can help regenerate landscapes and soils. At the same time, when we can integrate urban edibles into food forests and into urban applications, it can help regenerate communities as well. And some of the examples we'll share today, we'll talk about regeneration, the physical regeneration of soils, but can also talk about how communities have actually regenerated at different ways through landscape regeneration. So when we talk about landscape regeneration as a whole, there can be a lot of different ways that that's applied. It can include replanting vegetation in riparian or streamside corridors with edibles. It can include composting for soil building, rain gardens, and biofilters. But what we're going to focus today primarily is in urban and rural settings and edibles. Some of the examples use a design tool called permaculture, which is an ecological design tool that is a contraction of 2 words, permanent and culture or agriculture. And you'll see one urban example in Seattle in a few minutes that came out of a permaculture design class. So we wanted to showcase a few different ways that different sites have done landscape regeneration, urban edibles, and built food forests. And one of them is in Albemarle County in Virginia, and it is Innisfree Farm. And it is one of the most ambitious landscape regeneration projects that I've ever seen. You can see that they have a series of at least 7 different practices they've stacked on top of each other to regenerate the soil. This is an over 500-acre farm for adults who are differently abled, and you can see the link on the bottom, innisfreevillage.org, which is where the photo credit's from. And I'm not going to go into the detail here. You're welcome to email me and I can send you an article about this. It's a fascinating project, but some things that they're doing include applying compost tea, broad scale, applying raw milk, working with researchers and professors at different universities to see how the bacteria level in the soil is increased, doing intensive rotational grazing, cocktail seeding with a variety of leguminous and perennial plants. So they're basically innovating like crazy. And that's one of the key things that we found is that it takes site owners and municipalities just trying different things, communicating and seeing what works to be able to get urban edibles rolling, and also to do landscape regeneration. So Innisfree is a really fabulous example of stacking practices for landscape regeneration. And they are actually doing a lot of underground soil mapping for soil porosity and how the soil health has improved over time. So they have a research element to it as well, which is really exciting. So the next example we're going to look at is a forest garden actually at our place, where we do dialogue and design, primarily does design facilitation, but we also have our own research plot here. It's a little bit of the 9 acres we have in Admiral County. This is almost an acre total, and it's an edible forest garden. So when we talk about what is a food forest or an edible forest garden, it's basically gardening like a forest. And we're using nature as our guide to be able to do forest gardening. Some of the key elements include mulch, using thick mulch to help create healthy soil, to help suppress weeds, to retain moisture in the soil, and to help keep the soil covered so that we don't have soil runoff. We have a lot of different plants and multiple layers, and those layers include roots, the root layer, where we could actually grow things like potatoes or carrots. The herbaceous layer, plant examples could include lettuce or marigolds. Ground cover, strawberries and chamomile, shrubs, low story plants, upper story plants, and vining plants such as grapes or hardy kiwis. Now, we planted our edible forest garden in a workshop about 8 years ago at this point, and we wanted to see what would work and what didn't work. We've planted hundreds upon hundreds of plants, and some plants have made it and some plants haven't. And that's been part of the intention, is to see what does well over time, what's hardy enough to withstand our sometimes very hard winters, sometimes very mild winters, sometimes drought, sometimes not drought. So this is an example of the design for this edible forest garden at our place. And the basic architecture of it is to have a fruit tree planted at 15 feet on center. These are substandard to, they're grafted on. This is more information than some people will want, but MM111 is the rootstock that I grafted the trees onto. So we have a variety of disease-resistant fruit trees that have, not only are they disease-resistant, but they have a variety of uses for the fruit and a variety of ripening times. They cross-pollinate each other. So again, we have 15 foot on center trees, shrubs in between that, and then understory plants, and then different layers planted throughout. These pathways are put in on contour, and what that means, if you can see these pink lines, are topography lines. So that's basically where a topography line is. So we have at the very top, this is the top of the hill, we have a swale, which is a ditch on contour that is actually capturing water from about 1.5 acres uphill. The water flows through a culvert under the driveway, and it comes into the swale, and it basically waters the top of the forest garden. And after about 3 years, creates a lens of water, if you will, where we're getting a continual seepage of water into the forest garden. That's a key part of the design. So that swale is on contour, the pathways are on contour. We've moved different animals through the system over time. And we actually established initially with pigs to clear the landscape, because we had a lot of different plants that we wanted to get rid of, and we wanted the pigs to root them out. We've kept chickens and bees. So here's a picture from 2013 of the forest garden going in. That's the initial swale going in at the top. We covered the entire ground with sheet mulching, which is layers of cardboard and mulch on top of it, with different types of compost as well. You can see the winter and the water standing in the swale at the top. This is in the early years. You can see we planted a lot of bulbs and flowers. We have figs here, and trying to see if we put some rocks in on the north side of those figs, wondering if that's going to be enough protection for the figs. Hasn't been. And it's just grown over time. This is a few years after that. You can see the plants starting to come in. We have it all fenced in now because deer are a real thing. And we've also planted a lot of pollinators throughout the, from native milkweeds to coneflower to Joe Pye weed and sunchokes. We planted a lot of different flowers in to keep a variety of things in bloom over the course of the year. This is a few years ago. That's our son and a friend. And you can see, we're not going for a super ornamental aesthetic. We're going for function and seeing what works. Bee balm has been fabulous. And we've also experimented with edible vegetables that are perennial. So here is sea kale that we got at the Tufton Farm near Monticello. And we have layers of plants. A couple of our workhorse plants, you'll see it in a minute in more detail here. This is a Bocking 14 comfrey. It's a fabulous plant. It draws so many pollinators. We can cut it at the ground level and actually use it as mulch. This is a Baptisia or false blue indigo, great blooms, and then here's a fig. So you can see what we're doing is having different layers of plants growing up, and that's what we mean by a food forest. You can see under the blueberries, we have iris and comfrey growing. So we're stacking different plants to be able to form an ecosystem through the food forest over time. So to go into a couple of the plants and then a few other examples. These are the plants that really form the basis and core for a lot of this food forest and other urban edibles that we designed for folks. So comfrey, the Bocking 14, does not spread in the same way that some other comfrey plants do. They stay in place and they get about 3 feet tall. Great bloom time. The pollinators love this comfrey. One of the key things about this comfrey, it's what we would call a dynamic accumulator. I mean, it has a massive deep mining root system that brings nutrients up from the soil and makes them available for plants at the top. So as the leaves basically die in place every year, or as we chop and drop, so again, we can cut it at the base and do that up to 3 times a year. The leaves will regrow. It will make the nutrients available at the ground layer. So it's a really fabulous plant to have. You can see a sickle that we have here for mulching. I cannot emphasize how much we love this plant, and we have planted it throughout the forest garden. The next one is New Jersey tea, or Ceanothus americanus. It is a native plant to the eastern US, 3 to 4 feet. Another great bloom time, not as hardy as a lot of our other plants, but it does attract hummingbirds and butterflies. It is very drought tolerant, dry soil. It's tolerant of black walnut or juglone, and it's nitrogen fixing. And what that means is it takes nitrogen from the air and through nodules on the roots make it available to other plants. And we have a nitrogen fixing plant for every major feeder plant. So for every major shrub or every major tree, we have a nitrogen fixing plant. Like false blue indigo or Baptisia, another plant that's native to the eastern US. It attracts butterflies, it has a strong tolerance, and it's also nitrogen fixing, and it's gorgeous. You know, these big purple blooms are really lovely to see throughout the landscape. So those are some of the plants that we love. Some of the other examples of fruit trees that we've planted, you can see the Gold Rush apple, Burford pear. That's actually named after Tom Burford, who is a wonderful elder that I've learned. Some of you may know him. The Tiff Blue blueberry and Shenandoah pawpaw. Those are some examples of the edible plants, but we really have focused on regionally adapted and disease-resistant fruit trees and shrubs. We're also planning for pollinators. That's really a key part of our strategy and integrating animals into the landscape. So you can see on the bottom left, we've had bees throughout the landscape, moving chickens throughout time, and we've focused on a number of different herbaceous plants, and some have done really well, some haven't done so well over time, and you can see some examples there. So that's our forest garden. To zoom out a little bit, we're just going to hit a couple different examples of urban sites, including the Beacon Food Forest, which is a really exciting one. This is in Seattle, Washington. We visited this 8 years ago on a trip. The idea came out of a permaculture design class, and it's 7 acres in the city of Beacon, and the plants and the different foods that were planted were based on what communities from many different ethnicities wanted. So there is a very strong immigrant population right around this site, and people were able to say, hey, I would really love to see this planted. I'd love to see that planted, and a lot of different really excited things planted at the site. It's a public-private partnership. The city is a partner in this, and there are community gardens as well. Here's an example of the design on the top. Really beautiful design. They had a professional landscape architect help do the design, which really helped with engagement. Beaconfoodforest.org is the website. You can see our son, he's 13 now, you know, he was 5 there running through the forest garden. You can see they did sheet mulching, trees, and they have volunteer work days for maintenance, which is so key. And Sarah's going to talk about in just a minute how key that maintenance strategy is. Engaging volunteers has been a really big part of this project, though. And you can see an aerial of it there. It is very much part of the community, though, and done in partnership and in communication with the broader community so that it's not an idea that just lands out of nowhere, but it's something that really is something that the community wanted to see. I'm not going to go into this project in detail, but it's the Bama Canal in China. It is such a cool project. You can read more about it at ecological.com. It is basically a canal that has a restore technology, which is a floating island walkway with over 12,000 plants and 20 native species that were planted to treat over 750,000 gallons of raw sewage daily in this city of 6 million people. It's a 600-meter long canal and has different aeration systems. And it is amazing what this restorer has done. So you can see on the right-hand side what the canal looks like. This is the canal that connects, talking about urban edibles and walkways. There are flowering plants that are edible along it, and it has done a tremendous job at increasing the water quality throughout the Baima. It's just a fabulous example. And this is another type of and a poultry processing plant on the Eastern Shore, a very similar type of restorer technology from Todd Ecological. And to wrap up, we'll look at the Western Mass Pollinator Network, which is from Western Massachusetts. And this is another example of how we can help promote and share urban edibles at a broader scale. This pollinator project is a really great example of how a community has come together to develop and share resources for people who might not know a lot about gardening to be able to get plants, learn how to plant them. They have a nonprofit and they recruit volunteers to design, plant, and maintain municipal pollinator pathways. You can read more at wmassbs.org, and the whole system is designed to connect pollinating systems together. So they have a lot of handouts, like how to plant pollination systems, plant lists, like 25 native plants that can attract 7 or more native bee genera. I love how they're just thinking in systems, and it's a really great example of how to connect systems together for people to learn more. And with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Sarah to start sharing her screen. And again, we welcome your questions in the chat roll as we move forward. So Sarah, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Christine. Just let me know if you see this. Working all right?
Yep. I can see the slide, but yep, looks great.
Okay, awesome. All right, so now we're going to move into some of the challenges as well as opportunities of increasing food forests. So I invite you to list some challenges that you've encountered or you can think of related to implementing or increasing food forests in your community. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is based off some research I did at Virginia Tech. I studied agroforestry and I focused on urban areas. So when I asked Virginia mayors of towns, pretty small towns, less than 25,000 people, mayors responded that long-term maintenance was by far the biggest challenge that they saw related to implementation of food forests. So about 4 in 5 of them chose this. Then about 1 in 2 picked lack of space, followed by hazards related to fallen fruits and nuts, competing land uses, food safety concerns, changing the aesthetics of the town, and reduced visibility hazards. So these are all important to think about when addressing these challenges. So I have a few strategies that I'd like to share with you that really came straight out of the research. Policy development is really important for protecting food forests and encouraging them. So developing municipal ordinances to protect food forests and other edible landscapes from competing uses is critical because perennial vegetation, of course, requires secure land tenure. You can't move a fruit and nut tree every year because all of a sudden there's a development where you were working. And that's difficult even with an annual vegetable garden. So secure land tenure is key. I just want to share a few quotes with you all from policy actors that I interviewed in major cities across the United States who developed these kinds of municipal ordinances. And it just really highlights why they did what they did. So one said, the primary reason for adopting the policy was to provide land security for community leaders who have been caring for the land in their neighborhood for a long time and to secure those spaces for the community. Another said, without the policy, there would be no security at all. And people come to think of the land as their communities and they put so much effort and love into it. But from the city's point of view, it's not theirs at all. And that's before they passed the policy, of course. And then Another really key aspect of policy isn't even just secure land tenure. It's outlining a process for people who want to use, develop, and steward food forests and other edible landscapes. Sometimes people just don't know that they're allowed to do something, or they're not sure what kinds of species are okay. So just outlining that process really helps, even if these kinds of spaces aren't specifically prohibited to begin with. So some other quotes, these came back from the mayors who hadn't passed these kinds of policies, but they thought they would be important. We don't specify what types of plants or trees are required in our zoning codes. So food producing trees and shrubs are allowed, but not commonly planted. I think council should set policy to encourage those types of plantings. Another said, it must be in the code and comprehensive plan. If it's not in the code when the current council or mayor leaves, the next generation would not know what to do. And also highlighting the land security issue, these codes and plans ensure that they will be allowed for a long period of time. And lastly, another said zoning, excuse me, zoning would assist with the lack of physical space question to be able to point to the right areas. So that was a direct challenge that 1 and 2 mayors already identified, lack of physical space. So I'd like to highlight this example of Cleveland, Ohio. They're very progressive. Back in 2007, they adopted a urban garden zoning district. So that gives the city the ability to reserve land specifically for garden use through zoning. And while it permits urban gardens, such as food forests, it prohibits all other uses of the property. And the only kinds of infrastructure allowed are like tables, benches, chairs. And an advantage to this, of course, is protecting from other uses and secure land tenure. But it's also important to think about a potential disadvantage with this strategy is a lack of flexibility with what you can do with the space. So if the community decides to move on and it's not a successful food forest anymore, a community garden, then it's just kind of a vacant lot. But that's just something to think about if you're interested in developing policy. This strategy that I'm going to go into next is just be inclusive. And this relates not just to developing policies, but starting a food forest or edible landscape anywhere. It's really critical to include the affected communities in the conversations and decision-making. You can't just go in and plant a food forest in a neighborhood without talking to the people who live there. That's not going to go over well, and it's not going to be successful in the long run. Working with government officials is also key to make sure that you're not doing anything that's going against the codes, but also if you're working on policy, for example, they can help you with language in the codes that's not contradictory to other codes that they have. It's just good to get the government involved in this case, and also scientific and technical experts. As I said, this increases acceptance by the community, improves long-term success. So you don't just need secure land tenure, but you need the security within the community that they're going to be supportive. And it's also a really important opportunity to engage in conversations about nutrition, agricultural education, cooking, ecology, environmental justice, and more. So as Christine said, I'm going to go a little bit into maintenance because it is definitely the #1 challenge identified. And I think anybody that does restoration work knows this. Maintenance is always the struggle. So avoid miscommunication, do the research on each species, what's involved in the maintenance, and develop a really good plan, not just for the following year, but years out, 5-10 years. Think about what that's going to look like. Also in your maintenance plan, it's important to address liability and aesthetics related concerns, such as the downed fruits and nuts, food safety, and visibility and rights of way. So I recommend always talking to like Department of Transportation, making sure that you're not planting in a right of way and they're just going to cut it down. So you don't want to do that. And also it's a safety issue. Partnering with a land trust or another nonprofit organization can really help with this. They can provide the long-term staffing needed or volunteers and organize those volunteers. They also have technical expertise, liability coverage, and they can protect the land and the community's interest and vision for the site in the long run. So I'd like to just provide the example of Baltimore Green Space. They work with the city. Again, it's kind of like a public nonprofit partnership. And they're doing some really great work there. It's not just food forests, it includes all types of green space that they help to steward, but it's a good urban land trust. And I'd also like to share with you the city of Madison, Wisconsin. They have an edible landscapes permit process. So anybody in the city who wants to plant on public land can apply or go through this permit process where they work directly with the city departments that are key, or especially like if Parks owns this land, you want to talk with Parks to make sure you're not planting in a former brownfield, or like what was the former site use? It's really important to know what it was. Was it a former landfill? Are you about to plant in somewhere where there's utilities? So talking with stormwater utility, water utility, engineering, and then by engaging in these conversations and this kind of process, they also are able to provide technical expertise and advice with your maintenance plan. And then they're talking among each other. So again, you don't want to plant something and then have a maintenance crew for the city come down and mow down your seedlings that you just planted. So I really like this example from Madison. Another strategy is to emphasize the traditional functions of conventional types of green space. So communities and elected officials alike value the preservation of green space usually. And while it's more common that they are accepting food production in public space, it's still not quite the same, or like it's still not as widely accepted as just typical green space in your average parks that don't have food forests or fruit nut trees on them. So think about when you're trying to sell a food forest, think about how the structure and function of your food forest or edible landscape complement more common uses and visions of public green space that are more accepted. So can you have people running through your food forest or hiking through it, or doing yoga, having picnic tables, all the kinds of things you might see in a typical green space. And then the last strategy that I'll cover is agrifitting, which is basically just retrofitting a space with agriculture. So planting in and around existing green and gray infrastructure can be really helpful if you don't have a lot of space. So yeah, addresses the challenge of lack of space as well as aesthetic concerns and even competing land uses. So planting on a roof, for example, or this space that doesn't look like there's a lot of room, but you never know what you can squeeze in there. It just takes a little creativity. And so I'm going to share with you this tool now that can help with that. All right, so foodplaces.org is not only it's a resource that provides thousands of productive perennial plant species that you can use in these kinds of spaces, but they also have this foodscape tool. So it takes these kinds of typical urban spaces that you'll see, like a highway median, street median, rights of way, a parking lot, roundabouts. They have these different templates. So I'm just going to quickly go through with you an example. So this is, I picked public square. Okay, I'm just going to do the Appalachian Mountains because that's where I am. And then, so you enter in where you're doing the project, and then you have these different horizons, an overstory. Let's say we want that to be max 30 feet. Of course, all this is going to just depend on the site and your goals for the site. I'm just doing this kind of arbitrarily, but I clicked activate areas. And now, so for this public square, they take like a core space, intermediary, and a boundary. All you have to enter technically is a boundary. So I'm just going to do that real fast. And then, let's see, come on. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but you can also check the types of species that you want planted. So forbs, shrubs, grasses, trees, vines. There's a whole bunch of things you can check off depending on what you want for the site. And also right here, the maintenance required. If you want it to be easy, just click low and it'll give you species that don't require a lot of maintenance. So that's pretty cool. Again, I'm not doing this full out here, but I'll just click canopy, and then it'll, in the end, if you fill that out correctly, the way that you want it based on the site, it's going to give you a list of species that fit each part of the space. So for the overstory horizon, it's giving me this canopy, it's giving me these species. And so these species are native to the area that you're planting, and they should fit your needs for the space. So even if you don't really use it exactly like they intended, I think it just is really cool to think about how you can work or how you can agrifit a space, and they just kind of give you a jumping off point. So yeah, again, that's just foodplaces.org. And now I'm going to stop sharing. I think I just, okay, no, I clicked pause share. Sorry, I'm having an issue. Okay, there we go. Stop share. I'm back. Do we have any questions for the presenters?
That's such a great tool. Thanks so much, Sarah. I love the agrifit.
Thanks.
At this point, I don't see any questions. So maybe I'll just jump in with one. I'm curious, the picture of the apple tree and the kids picking the apples. Of course, I'm always a bit of a pessimist at times. I'm like, what happens if somebody gets sick after consuming something like this? You mentioned the liability considerations. Are there liability issues related to foodborne illnesses associated with these kinds of practices?
Oh, that's such a good question. Oh, Ron, I'd have to say consult your attorney for that question. That's such a good one. I'm going to turn that one over to Sarah in just a moment. I do want to let folks know that we do welcome your questions in the chat roll, feedback in the chat roll as well. And then we have a question for you, and we're going to be going into breakout groups in just a couple minutes. So stay tuned, stay on board. So we have about 35 more minutes. Sarah, what are your thoughts about that question? That's a good one.
Yeah, I think it is a good one. And honestly, I would have to say, like, I would just work with the government officials and seeking legal advice on that one. I think it probably depends on the town itself. Maybe smaller towns, it wouldn't be as much of a concern, but it's definitely something you want to think about and make sure you talk to the right people. I think there is a concern with foodborne illness. And again, working with a nonprofit maybe who has the kind of insurance to cover that, I guess, would be important. It's something I think people are concerned about, and definitely something that elected officials would want to know before you start a project.
And I think at the same time, urban edibles are they're becoming more and more normalized, I'd say, across the way, similar to community forest gardens. And people are learning about plants that grow in urban spaces that are edible. There are always concerns about, roadways and heavy metal accumulation potentially from vehicles and things like that. But I think that the corollary concern is what happens when people don't eat local, and what about obesity, and what about, the health effects of not having an access to food. And I hear those types of conversations about food equity. To be honest, I hear those types of conversations being elevated more than the foodborne illness at the municipal scale around, do people have access to food? How far is it? How far does somebody have to walk or catch a bus or drive to a farmer's market or grocery store or an urban ag location? So I think that that's part of the conversation too, but it is an interesting question.
Yeah, it actually just sparked something I wanted to say. Another advantage to using perennials, I've heard this before. I think there's some good research papers on it that you're kind of separating, again, that's like one layer further, so to speak, from the ground itself. So a lot of times if you're in a more contaminated site, again, I wouldn't recommend planting anything in a brownfield per se, but that you're going to eat. But I think it's actually safer when it's like a tree than directly growing in the ground, like lettuce or spinach, for example. I thought that was interesting. Yeah,
great. So I think Jenny has her hand up, and there's a question in the chat roll. I also, Laura, if you'll go ahead and put the question in the chat roll, that we'd love to ask people about what are your favorite urban edibles and food forest plants. We'd love to hear from you about what are some of the plants that have been important. Could be ornamental, natives, but particularly edible. So we'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat roll there. Jenny.
Yeah, I will step up and talk. So this is kind of a question I had, or comment I made to what are the challenges, and you talked about maintenance, I think as being one of the key areas, and it kind of had my brain churning about how for urban tree canopy, how much we rely on volunteer-based tree stewards groups to help with the level of maintenance. And I mentioned, when you're managing for a crop versus what urban tree canopy care is complicated, but when you're managing for a crop, it's so much more, because you're worried about bud production and you're more worried about kind of pest and disease and everything that kind of comes with that level of stewardship. And so I was kind of curious, especially if food forests, let's say they take off as a more dominant, not just a one-off case, but more expansive part of the existing urban canopy, is like any thoughts or ideas around a similar kind of volunteer stewards program? I don't know if it's like master gardeners having a more active role, or what that could look like.
That's a great question, Jenny. Sarah, do you have thoughts on that?
I think those kinds of groups are popping up. Of course, Seattle is probably like one of the best examples, but I think they have something called City Fruit. And I think it's just becoming a lot more common to have that volunteer model, but definitely also having, in terms of the cities and the policy actors that I interviewed, it was really important to have a dedicated staff person. They all said that kind of relates back to the session earlier this morning that I listened to. You have to have one person who's really dedicated to making that their full-time job and managing the volunteers, even if you do have a volunteer program. So.
Yeah, and just to go to the Seattle example as well, when we went to the Beacon Food Forest, we happened to be there on a volunteer day, and there were dozens upon dozens upon dozens of people there, and the organizers were on it. They had a sign-up sheet for every volunteer to catalog their time and count it as an in-kind contribution towards a city grant. And so they not only had the volunteers doing the work, but they were able to catalog all the time from the volunteers and use that as a matching source for the grant funding, which was really smart. Being able to plan ahead and also letting people know what's in it for them in terms of an educational element. I've seen that be really important as well. So there are certainly many groups who manage, plants that we might not want to have in certain areas, but the flip side is replanting with plants that are desirable can be really exciting. So that's a good question, Jenny. There's a question earlier from Carly. Has pest management been an issue that either of you have experienced, even just birds or bugs? That's a good question. Sarah, any thoughts you want to share on that? I have a couple ideas, but want to see if there's anything you want to add first.
Oh, no, you go ahead. You can take that one.
So I would say pest management is always an issue. We have focused on planting a variety and diversity of plants as much as possible to be able to attract the carnivores for some of those pest insects to some degree. So a lot of times when we can, we focused on planting not only flowering herbaceous level plants, but shrubs and trees. The more birds that we can attract can help control a lot of the insect pests, but the more diversity we build into, in my experience, food forests and urban edibles, the more the ecosystem helps round out the needed predators for some of those pests. We have, at our place, we have almost 30 blueberry bushes, which is really way more blueberry bushes than anybody needs. And so there's enough in this case for the birds to take some. We don't actually fence our blueberries because we harvest way more than we need to and give some away. We certainly do harvest for deer though. Excuse me, we fence for deer though. We use a double strand electric fence that's 3 feet wide with 2 different strands because deer don't like to jump distance. Or height. We also have an 8-foot tall fence in a certain area. So protecting is important, but at the same time, being able to just plant abundance is helpful too. So we're going to get ready to go into breakout groups in just a minute. Are there any other questions from folks? Ron, do you see anything else? Some great plant suggestions in here. Figs, persimmons, berries, service berries. Absolutely. Ron, do you see any other questions?
No other questions in the chat here in Zoom or in Whova.
Okay, sounds good. So We have about half an hour left. We're going to go into breakout rooms just for about 20 minutes. So hang tight, if you will. And in the breakout rooms, what we're going to ask folks to do, they're just going to be randomly assigned breakout rooms. And we're going to ask folks to, so change that, instead of 25 minutes, you'll have about 20 minutes. Introduce yourself and your affiliation. Community member is a welcome affiliation, and why you're interested in urban edibles and food forest and regeneration as a whole. Sharing your reflections or takeaways from the presentation, your experience around regeneration. So share reflections, and then what lessons have you learned? What worked well and what pitfalls to avoid? And if it's just sharing your ideas as well, that's fine. Find somebody to take a couple notes from your breakout groups to bring back to the large group to share in the chat roll at the end. And we'll send out a couple different messages in the broadcasting message as well. So are there any questions about breakout rooms from anybody? You'll need to hit accept in a moment. Laura, anything we need to modify before we open up the breakout rooms?
I think we are all set, and I will broadcast these same instructions that are on the slide here once you all are in the groups again, so you have it fresh.
So have a great conversation, folks. We'll see you back in about 20 minutes, and we'll have a few minutes for large group discussion at the end.
Awesome.
Thanks, Laura. So folks, I hope you had a good chat. Feel free to turn your videos on. If you're in a place you can turn your videos on, and feel free to unmute yourselves if you're able to. Welcome back. Hope you had good conversations. So we have just a couple minutes left in the large group. We're going to wait for everybody to come back. We have 13 seconds or so. We'd love to hear what your groups talked about. Feel free to add your top ideas to the chat roll, or to just share them in a few minutes out loud. So we'll get the rest of the group back now. All right. Welcome back, everybody. We're glad to see you. So we just have a few more minutes left. So feel free to turn your video on. If you're in a place where you can turn your video on, feel free to unmute yourself. We'd love to just hear from some folks. What were your key takeaways? What were some questions folks had, or lessons learned? We'll just open it up to folks, so feel free to unmute yourself or add ideas to the chat roll.
Okay, I'll go first. Hi, I'm Ruth Castley. I'm from the Chesapeake Bay program. And I just took notes from my group. So we mostly had questions, and I just wanted to make sure I kind of run through some of those. One was, how can we get more of the food forests in urban areas where they are needed most? So how can we target areas where they might really help the community? And then we all had this question: any advice on overcoming some of the stigmas with native and edible gardens, like not looking like a formal garden? People's fear that they'll attract, well, that they do sometimes attract like rats, rabbits, bugs. Some people do not want bees, even though we think of that as a good thing. And then the general fear of having like more plant forest cover causes increase in crime. And then the last one, really big one, was what do you, do you have community input on the choice of plants so that, food actually gets eaten or distributed? How do you make sure it gets distributed equitably? And, do you spend time educating or have advice for how to get input from the community so that they're likely to use what's planted? So those were our main issues.
Great, Ruth. Those are such great questions. So we just have 5 minutes left. So if folks have responses to those questions or additional ideas or questions, feel free to add them to the chat roll. I will hit on a couple of responses to those questions, and Sarah, turn it over to you. I would say the Beacon Food Forest that we gave the example of in Seattle was designed with 100% community input. There was actually an urban design charrette. So there was a workshop where folks came together, shared ideas, what would work, what would not work. And as we mentioned, there has been a very active program for volunteers to continue to manage it. It was designed in a way so that it's at the edge of a recreational area, so that if fruit drops, there's not as much of a concern if someone steps on an apple or, what the aesthetics look like. But there's been an intentional effort to also I would say in Seattle and in many other places, value the aesthetics of messy, to start to value what a natural forest might look like with multiple layers and multiple, when I'm looking outside right now, there are leaves on the ground everywhere because that's how nature is dropping mulch onto the ground. And so starting to value the natural function. Jane Jacobs is a planner, eyes on the street. One of the things to the question about forest cover and crime is the more plants, and actually it's been shown in urban forests that the more urban forests, and I'm happy to try to cite the source of this, but I'd have to dig it up. The more urban community forests, the crime rate goes down because there's a stronger sense of place often and more eyes on the street. And so I think that often the more plants that you have, the safer a community is because there is more community interaction. In terms of rabbits, bugs, and bees, those are good questions, and it's going to depend on having the right plant in the right place. So for example, instead of having Nandina, which is a hip height shrub that's often planted, having blueberries don't attract the number of, it doesn't have the same type of fruit drop that some other shrubs or trees might. So it might be just making sure that you select the right plant in the right place, but absolutely engaging the community is key, particularly in design. Just popping in a forest garden in the middle of a park without engaging the community around it really isn't a great strategy across the board. Sarah, what would you add to those good questions?
I think you did a really great job covering that. I would just also add that, in addition to just educating about the messy landscapes and increasing crime question, just emphasizing the multifunctionality of the space again, and education, maybe having signs put that explain why it looks messy, or like if you're not going to cut things down in the winter time because you want to provide overwintering habitat for bugs or something, have a sign. And I think when people understand the reasoning behind it, they're more willing to accept it. In terms of targeting, I think the community will know if it's a need, but so just have it happen organically. But I know there's also a lot of data on food deserts and areas that need attention. So perhaps you can use that kind of data that's already out there, but then just working directly with the community. And I know there's a lot of other questions and we don't have a ton of time. So
yeah, but great questions. We welcome additional responses and from the knowledge that all of you have in the chat. To the question about partnering with nature centers or organizations for an educational experience for students, there is actually a lot of tremendous work taking place by folks doing work in Charlottesville, Virginia. There is Cultivate Charlottesville, who is intentionally looking at how to plant edibles and gardens at school systems, and they have a garden coordinator for every school. So they have volunteers and staff built in for maintenance and how to partner with school systems. But I think it again needs to emerge from what the intrinsic opportunity and request is from a nature center or school opportunity. But there are a lot of really cool schools. I've started a number of school gardens at different places where I've taught environmental ed in different places over time. And kids are usually really excited to harvest their own food that they've grown with their own hands. There's really nothing like that. Sarah, what else would you add to that question or any other comments in the chat roll?
I think also I see Ron wrote about the need for education, what is growing and how you can use it in your home. I've also worked with kids and we grew kale, and then I gave a little recipe on what they can do with the kale and like how it can be tasty. So just finding any kind of way to partner with what you're growing and what you could do with it when it gets home, the nutrition, education, and the other ways that they all overlap is important too.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sarah. So anything else that you want to respond to, Sarah, before we ask folks our final question?
I also just the challenge of implementing on a larger scale. I think that's always kind of going to be a challenge. And I think in some ways though, and not just in selected neighborhoods, I think in some ways it may be better in a way to just focus on selected neighborhoods at first that really want it in their community, and then it'll take time, but it'll happen sort of organically on its own instead of maybe forcing it on a neighborhood that doesn't want it. But we've kind of already touched on that too. So
yeah, and extra seeds, absolutely. The seeds can be used. There's a lot of different work happening in urban areas where folks are making, seed balls and distributing seeds in various places to help increase the diversity of plants. And that just depends on people innovating and taking the initiative to make something happen. So Sarah, do you want to pose our final question for folks to put in the chat roll? And Laura's going to add it there.
Yeah, so we just want you, we invite you all to think about one thing you can do in your community that furthers the goal of increasing perennial food production in urban areas, or not just urban areas, but wherever you live, really. So feel free to think about that. Sorry.
Yeah, if folks have any responses real quick, we'll give you 10 seconds to add that. What's one thing you can do to increase urban food production?
Hi everybody. I'm definitely going to go and buy some pawpaw tree seeds. I'm going to actually like add them to, because we have a nice big backyard and front yard. So I'm going to add that. And, you know, I know the rule is, I think you leave some out in the front for the community and you can leave the back, the ones in the back for your house. So that's something I'm going to be going to do.
I love that. That's such a great note to end on. You know, having some fruit in the front and some fruit in the back is a really great way to end it. So I want to thank everyone for your time today. Ron, I'm going to share the last slide here for you to close us out.
Great. Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Sarah. Let's give a virtual round of applause to our speakers. It was a great presentation and a lot of good discussion there. Thank you very much. Do encourage folks to provide feedback on this session. To do so on the session page in Whova, click the rate session button. We do also encourage you to share your experience in outdoor surroundings with us on social media. The hashtags are here on the screen. And we do invite you to join us tonight for our virtual trivia night. After that, please feel free to join us tomorrow morning when our conference resumes starting at 9 o'clock. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.